Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. So, I've never been the type to share my personal life online, but I feel like I need to tell this story. It's honestly the kind of thing you'd only believe if you read it in a book or saw it in a rom-com. Here's how it all began. It was a dreary Tuesday afternoon in February, and I was running late to my first day at a new job. Great first impression, right? The sky was that heavy shade of gray, like a weighted blanket smothering the city, and a light drizzle had quickly transformed into an all-out downpour. I dashed out of the subway station only to realize, yep, I'd forgotten my umbrella. As I stood there, contemplating a full sprint through the rain, I noticed someone else by the subway entrance. A woman around my age, holding a rather bright, oversized yellow umbrella. She was waiting at the entrance too, probably dreading the rain as much as I was. But she just stood there, relaxed and calm, like she had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to be there. I don't know what possessed me, but I asked, "Do you mind if I share your umbrella, just until the next corner?" She looked me up and down, like she was sizing up the possibility of me being a serial killer. But then she gave me this incredible smile. "Yeah, sure. It's not like I'd leave someone out in the rain, right?" We started walking together, and as cheesy as it sounds, I couldn't help but notice how the yellow of her umbrella cast a warm glow on her face, almost making the whole scene feel magical. Our conversation started off simple. I asked her name. She said it was Sarah. We talked about the rain, how we were both newcomers to the city, and how we both missed the small-town feel. And then suddenly, we found ourselves sharing little tidbits about our lives. She was an illustrator, specializing in children's books. No wonder she had such a sunny umbrella. I'm in marketing, and we joked about how I'd probably make her art sell out if we ever worked together. The walk to my office was only supposed to take 5 minutes, but we kept talking, stopping under awnings, taking detours around puddles, and dodging the crowded streets until I realized we had been walking for nearly 20 minutes. When we reached my office, I awkwardly said goodbye, not knowing if I'd ever see her again. But as I turned to go, she blurted out, "Hey, same time, same place tomorrow." The next day, same time, she was there with the yellow umbrella. It became a routine. Rain or shine, I'd see her at that spot and we'd walk together, laughing, sometimes in silence, just enjoying each other's presence. A few months into these daily walks, she surprised me by asking if I wanted to help her illustrate a story she was working on. "It's about 2 strangers in the rain," she said, giving me that playful smile that I had come to adore. She explained the whole story, and it was practically an illustrated version of our own story. I was so touched, it felt like a moment out of a movie. Now, fast forward to today. Sarah and I moved in together last year. She's currently working on her next big children's book, and I help her however I can. The yellow umbrella hangs by the door, a little memento of the rain and our serendipitous walks together. Every now and then, on a rainy day, we still meet at that subway entrance, just for old time's sake. Some people say the universe has a way of making things happen, and maybe it does. Or maybe it was just a random Tuesday in February that changed my life. Either way, I'm grateful. Alright, I know this sounds cliche, but I have to share this story. This happened 2 years ago, but it feels like yesterday. It's long, but I promise it's worth the read if you're a sucker for unexpected romance. I was the last person to expect that I'd meet someone who would change my life in the middle of the night at a 24-hour cafe. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and to put it lightly, I was going through a rough patch. At the time, I was working at a startup, which basically meant I was surviving off caffeine and no sleep. Trying to make something out of nothing. One particular night, I found myself wide awake at 2 a.m. after another long workday. With my head buzzing and no hope of falling asleep, I threw on a hoodie and decided to take a walk to the nearby 24-hour cafe. When I got there, it was nearly empty, just a barista cleaning the counters and a handful of college students working on assignments. I ordered a black coffee, found a spot by the window, and just sat there, trying to make sense of everything in my life. Then she walked in. She had on a giant scarf wrapped around her neck, an oversized sweater, and one of those beanies that looks like it's barely staying on. She looked like she'd just come from a snowstorm, cheeks flushed red, with strands of hair poking out under her hat. She walked to the counter, ordered her drink, a caramel macchiato with extra whipped cream. I found this out later, of course, and looked around the cafe, probably expecting it to be as empty as I did. Our eyes met, and she flashed me this warm, genuine smile. I don't know why, but something in me told me to wave. So I did. To my surprise, she walked over, carrying her drink and wearing this curious smile. She asked, "Mind if I sit here? You look like someone who could use a little company." For some reason, I didn't even hesitate. I nodded, and she took the seat across from me. She introduced herself as Emma, and we started talking. What began as casual small talk about late-night coffee turned into a conversation that flowed so naturally, it was as if we'd known each other for years. Emma was a journalist, and she had that same curiosity that always makes you feel like she's genuinely interested in everything you say. She told me about her latest project, a series of interviews with local artists in the city. She had so many stories, hilarious, touching, and everything in between. I found myself opening up about my own struggles, my dreams, and even the recent breakup I hadn't yet processed. It was like the world outside the cafe didn't exist, just us, sitting there with the hum of quiet jazz in the background. Hours passed, and before I knew it, the sun was rising. Emma looked out the window, saw the sky lightening, and said, "Well, I guess I better head home. My editor won't be happy if I miss my deadline again." She laughed, and I felt this pang of disappointment, like a spell was about to break. But just as she was about to leave, she turned and asked, "Same time tomorrow?" That was the beginning of our midnight ritual. Every night for the next 2 weeks, we'd meet at that cafe around 2 a.m. and talk until sunrise. We covered everything under the sun, or moon, I guess, from our childhood dreams to our biggest fears. She told me about her bucket list, how she'd always wanted to learn to surf, and even confessed her irrational fear of jellyfish. Don't ask, she still gets embarrassed about it. There was something special about that time with her, the way it felt like we were the only two people in the world. We had our own little universe in that cafe. Those late-night talks made me forget about my heartbreak and all the stress in my life. I felt like I was falling in love again, this time without fear. One night, 2 weeks into our routine, Emma didn't show up. I waited, but she didn't come. I didn't even have her number. I realized we'd been meeting purely by this unspoken promise. No phones, no social media. Just us. The barista, who'd seen us together every night, walked over and asked if I was all right. She saw the look on my face and handed me a napkin with a phone number scribbled on it. "She told me to give you this, just in case," she said with a wink. I called Emma that morning, my heart racing. She answered right away, sounding exhausted but happy to hear my voice. Turned out she'd caught the flu and had been too sick to make it out. Hearing her voice was all it took. I was relieved and realized just how much she meant to me. When she recovered, we met at the cafe, but this time it felt different. She reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "What if we tried seeing each other, during normal hours?" We laughed, and that was it. We started dating, first during the day, exploring the city together, meeting friends, watching movies. But every now and then, we'd still go back to that cafe at 2 a.m., just to relive those nights when it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Fast forward to today. Emma and I have been together for nearly 2 years now. We've moved in together, started planning our travels, and she's even got me learning to surf. The jellyfish thing is still an obstacle, but we're working on it. Every now and then, we go back to that cafe, order our usual drinks, and sit in our old spot by the window, reminiscing about those first few magical nights. Sometimes I think about how lucky I am that I decided to go to that cafe on a random Tuesday night. Meeting Emma wasn't planned, but it turned out to be exactly what I needed. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. I'm usually a private person, but I've got a story that I think belongs here. It's long, so bear with me if you're into tales of chance, serendipity, and just a bit of fate. 3 years ago, I was going through what can only be described as one of the lowest points in my life. I'd recently moved to a new city for a job that promised to be amazing, but ended up being anything but. I felt isolated, was still adjusting to the endless crowds and busy city streets, and my loneliness weighed on me every single day. Then came the day my car broke down on a deserted road on my way to visit a small town nearby. It was late afternoon, and I was stranded on a road where no tow trucks were coming anytime soon. My phone battery was at 5%, and my anxiety was at 100%. As I was trying to figure out what to do, a small silver sedan slowed down and pulled over. A woman in her late 20s with short curly hair stepped out, looking both confident and kind. She waved as she approached, and when she saw the frustration and exhaustion on my face, she just said, "I'm Sophie. Looks like you could use a hand?" Before I could answer, she was already checking under the hood with me. I could tell she knew a thing or two about cars because she started assessing the issue right away. We couldn't fix it there, but she offered to give me a ride to a nearby repair shop. Feeling utterly defeated and out of options, I accepted. The drive wasn't long, but something about her put me at ease almost instantly. She had this calming presence and an open, friendly smile that made me feel safe, even though she was a total stranger. We chatted about where we were from, our favorite places to visit, our jobs. She told me she worked as a freelance photographer, capturing landscapes and unique urban scenes. I told her I was working in a tech job that had barely left me time to even enjoy the city I'd moved to. For the first time in months, I found myself genuinely laughing and talking without holding back. We got to the repair shop, where she not only waited with me, but also helped me navigate the process, because I was in panic mode and not exactly thinking clearly. She stayed until I was all set, and when everything was handled, she handed me a small note with her number on it. "Text me if you ever need a friend in the city," she said with that same warm smile. After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I hesitated for a week, overthinking everything. But finally, I gathered the courage to text her, and she responded almost immediately. We met for coffee, and I quickly realized she was just as warm and caring as she'd seemed that day by the roadside. She told me about her photography, her love for night drives around the city, and how she would stay up to see the sunrise because of the way the early light touched the buildings. I'd never met anyone like her, someone who saw beauty in all the little things that most people missed. Our friendship took off, and in time it blossomed into something deeper. Sophie was the kind of person who would listen without judgment, and who found joy in the simplest things, like trying new street food or walking through the city's quieter neighborhoods. She taught me to slow down and appreciate my life in ways I'd forgotten I could. I loved watching her behind the camera, fully immersed in her art, capturing the world through her unique lens. One night, about a year into our friendship, we went for a drive around the city just as a light rain started to fall. The streets were slick, the lights reflecting on the pavement, creating a soft glow. She pulled over at one of her favorite overlooks, a small park on a hill that looked out over the city skyline. We sat there quietly, side by side, taking it all in. I'd never felt so peaceful in my life. She turned to me, her eyes full of something indescribable, and asked, "Do you believe in moments of fate?" I barely got to answer before she leaned over and kissed me. It was a soft, tentative kiss that held so much warmth. I'd been waiting for that moment, maybe without even realizing it. That kiss changed everything. We fell into a relationship that felt like home, the kind of love that grew slowly, like roots digging deeper over time, anchoring me in a way I hadn't known I needed. Sophie became my anchor, my partner, my best friend. She helped me explore the city with new eyes, finding hidden corners, unknown cafes, and small bookstores. We spent lazy Sundays in bed with coffee and books, took spontaneous road trips to quiet beaches and mountains, and shared everything, our fears, dreams, and hopes. Today, Sophie and I are still together. We moved into a small apartment with a view of the city lights she loves so much, and our life has become an adventure of shared memories, laughter, and love. We still take those late-night drives and sit at that hill overlooking the skyline. Our little world that began with a chance roadside encounter has become the love of my life. Some people say love is about finding someone who completes you, but with Sophie, I've learned it's about finding someone who makes you more complete within yourself. And all it took was a broken down car, a ride with a stranger, and a dash of fate. This is a story I never thought I'd be sharing. But here I am, writing down one of the most important chapters of my life. It's long, but if you have a soft spot for love stories, I think you'll appreciate it. I'll start from the beginning, the moment that changed everything. It was the middle of a freezing December night, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I'd been driving back from a work event that went longer than expected. I was exhausted, freezing, and desperate to just get home. Somewhere between a missed exit and a malfunctioning GPS, I ended up on a winding, unfamiliar road that seemed to go on forever. My phone had died, and my car decided that this was the perfect time to sputter and die too. I was in full-on panic mode, wrapped up in my coat with nothing but the silence and the vast, empty landscape around me. Then, like something out of a movie, a pair of headlights appeared on the road ahead. I watched as a car slowed down and pulled over next to mine. A tall, slightly disheveled guy with messy dark hair stepped out. He looked just as wary as I was, probably wondering if he was making a mistake stopping for a random stranger at midnight on an empty road. But he walked over, and with a cautious smile, asked if I was okay. I explained my situation, feeling a bit embarrassed, and he offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station, where I could call for help. Something about his calm, kind presence made me feel safe, so I agreed. His name was Alex, and as we drove, we started talking. I learned that he was a musician, a singer-songwriter who'd just come back from a gig in a neighboring town. He had this incredible, genuine energy, warm and funny, with a dry sense of humor that kept me laughing and calmed my nerves. It was like the stress of the night melted away with every mile we drove. We reached the gas station, and he offered to stay with me until my tow truck arrived. We sat in the warmth of his car, sipping terrible coffee from the gas station and talking. For hours, we shared stories. Everything from our favorite books and movies to our biggest fears and dreams. He told me about his struggles with his music, how he'd spent years trying to make it, but still felt unsure of his path. I told him about my job, how I'd always wanted to do something creative, but had ended up in a corporate role that didn't feel right. Somewhere in that long conversation, I felt a connection I hadn't felt in a long time. When the tow truck finally arrived, I thanked him for everything. I didn't expect to see him again. After all, it was just a chance encounter. But as I was about to leave, he handed me his number, smiling a little shyly. "In case you need saving again," he said with a grin. The next day, I couldn't get him out of my mind. I debated whether to text him, feeling ridiculous for being so excited about a guy I barely knew. But I finally caved and sent him a message. He replied instantly, and soon we were texting every day, sharing little bits of our lives. We met up a week later for coffee, and what started as a simple date turned into a marathon conversation. I realized that he was as easy to talk to in the daylight as he had been in the middle of the night on that deserted road. Our relationship blossomed slowly. Alex was patient and steady, the type of person who made you feel valued with just a glance. He'd bring me small gifts, a book he thought I'd like, a playlist he made of songs that reminded him of me, or even just my favorite coffee on days when he knew I was stressed. I'd find myself opening up to him in ways I never had with anyone else. He listened without judgment, encouraging me to be my truest self. A few months into dating, he invited me to one of his performances. I'd never seen him play live before, so I was nervous but excited. The small, dimly lit venue was filled with people who seemed to adore him, and when he got up on stage, I understood why. He poured his heart into every song, his voice filling the room with raw emotion. At one point, he looked straight at me in the crowd and smiled in a way that made my heart skip a beat. I felt seen, like he was singing just for me. That night, I realized I was in love with him. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges, though. Being with a musician came with its own set of difficulties. His late-night gigs, the unpredictable schedule, the constant ups and downs of pursuing his dream. There were moments I felt frustrated, moments when I wondered if I could handle the instability that came with his lifestyle. but every time I doubted, he'd reassure me, showing me that he was just as committed to making it work as I was. One night, after a long, difficult day, we ended up sitting on the floor of his tiny apartment, just talking. He looked at me, took my hands, and said, "You make everything make sense. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I know I want you by my side through everything." I was speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of his sincerity. It was in that moment I knew that whatever challenges came our way, I wanted to face them with him. 2 years later, we're still together. He's had some incredible breakthroughs in his music career, and I've finally left my corporate job to pursue a career in art, something he encouraged me to do every step of the way. We've built a life that feels like a beautiful blend of both our dreams. We still laugh about the night we met, how neither of us expected a broken-down car and a midnight rescue to lead to the love of our lives. Looking back, I can't believe how that random encounter changed everything. It taught me that sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them. And every time I see Alex on stage, doing what he loves, I feel an overwhelming gratitude that we found each other in that strange, fateful moment on a cold December night. All right, settle in because this is a long story. If you've ever been curious about how fate works in the strangest ways, I think you'll appreciate this. About 3 years ago, I was in a rough spot. I'd just ended a 5-year relationship and felt like I was spinning in a void. I'd buried myself in work, hoping that by staying busy I'd somehow heal. But eventually, it all caught up with me. On a whim, I decided to take a solo trip to Italy, a way to hit reset, I told myself. The plan was simple. Take a break from everything, eat good food, see beautiful things, and hopefully come back with a fresh perspective. But of course, things didn't go as planned. I was at the airport, running late, as usual, when I learned that my connecting flight was delayed. Then, thanks to the delay, I ended up missing my flight to Rome altogether. Exhausted, frustrated, and with no idea what to do next, I sat down on one of those uncomfortable airport chairs, feeling completely defeated. As I was sitting there, I noticed a guy a few seats over. He was on the phone, clearly trying to sort out his own travel issues. There was something oddly familiar about him, like we'd met before, though I was sure we hadn't. Eventually, he got off the phone and looked over at me, giving a sympathetic smile. "Missed connection?" he asked. I nodded, and he laughed, saying, "Join the club." His name was James, and as it turned out, he was also headed to Rome. He'd missed the same flight I did, and now we were both stranded, waiting for the next one in 6 hours. We started talking to pass the time, and it was easy in a way I hadn't expected. James was warm, quick-witted, and had this infectious energy that made me forget how tired and annoyed I was. He told me he was a travel photographer, which explained the camera slung over his shoulder, and shared stories about the places he'd been and the people he'd met. Every story was like an adventure in itself, and I felt myself getting caught up in his world, captivated by the life he'd lived. Eventually, we decided to make the best of our layover together. We grabbed coffee, shared terrible airport sandwiches, and walked around the terminal, laughing at how we'd somehow turned the worst part of traveling into an oddly enjoyable experience. By the time our flight was finally called, it felt like we'd known each other for years. We sat together on the plane, talking the entire flight. He showed me his favorite photos, images that captured breathtaking moments. Sunrises over mountaintops, children playing in remote villages, cities lit up at night. I'd never met anyone who saw the world the way he did, with such curiosity and openness. When we landed in Rome, we exchanged numbers, said our goodbyes, and went our separate ways. I told myself that it was just one of those chance encounters, the kind that only happens once, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wanted to see him again. A few days later, I got a message from James. "Hey, I found this tiny hole-in-the-wall pasta place you'd love. Want to join?" I couldn't say no. That night, over plates of handmade pasta and red wine, something shifted. We talked for hours, diving into deep conversations about life, love, and our biggest fears. I opened up about my recent breakup, about feeling lost and unsure of myself. He listened without judgment, sharing his own struggles with feeling like he was always moving, but never really finding a place to call home. By the time we left the restaurant, I knew that this was more than just a casual connection. Over the next 2 weeks, James and I spent nearly every day together. We explored Rome like locals, wandering down hidden alleyways, getting lost in art galleries, eating gelato at midnight. He showed me parts of the city I never would have found on my own, capturing candid photos of me laughing, wide-eyed, completely immersed in the beauty of it all. Each moment felt like a snapshot of happiness, a rare kind of joy I hadn't felt in a long time. Our last night in Rome, we sat by the Tiber River, watching the lights dance on the water. James took my hand, looking at me with this quiet intensity. "I don't know what happens next," he said softly, "but I know that meeting you was more than just luck. I don't want this to end." I felt the same way, but I was scared. Scared of falling too hard, of getting hurt, of letting myself believe in something that felt too good to be true. But in that moment, I realized that sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. After we left Italy, we kept in touch, talking every day, sending each other photos and little updates from our lives. We'd visit each other whenever we could, and each reunion felt like coming home. With James, I didn't have to pretend to be anything I wasn't. He knew my flaws, my insecurities, and he loved me for them. Over time, I realized that what we had was real, something worth holding on to. About a year later, James decided to take a break from traveling and move to my city. We got our own place, a tiny apartment filled with mismatched furniture and walls covered in his photos. We still traveled, but now we did it together, creating new memories in every city, every country. We laughed, argued, made up, and built a life that was messy, beautiful, and wholly ours. A few months ago, we were back in Rome, revisiting all our favorite spots. On our last night, he took me to the same spot by the Tiber River. As we watched the sunset, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the same one he'd been using to jot down notes and ideas since we'd met. Inside was a list of every place we'd been together, every memory we'd made. On the last page, he'd written one line: "Will you make more memories with me, forever?" He pulled out a ring, and I could barely breathe. Of course, I said yes. Looking back, I still can't believe how one missed flight changed my entire life. It taught me that sometimes the best things happen when you're least expecting them. James was the last person I'd expected to meet that day, but he turned out to be the love of my life, my partner in every adventure. And now, we're planning a lifetime of memories together, filled with laughter, love, and endless possibilities. This might be a long one, but if you're a romantic at heart, I hope you'll enjoy it. It all started about 5 years ago. I was 27, in a rut, and looking for a change of scenery. I'd just left a 5-year relationship that I thought was going to be the one, and was living in a tiny studio apartment in a city that seemed to grow colder and more foreign with each passing day. To distract myself, I decided to go on a road trip. Something I'd always wanted to do, but never actually made time for. I didn't plan it out well. I just packed up my car, left a note for my landlord, and hit the road. Somewhere around the halfway point, I found myself in a small town that wasn't even on my original route. My car's GPS glitched out, and I got hopelessly lost. I pulled into a tiny, rundown gas station to try and figure out where I was, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. That's when I first saw her. She was leaning against an old pickup truck, wearing a well-worn denim jacket and cowboy boots, casually reading a dog-eared book. She looked like she belonged in a different era, quiet, focused, with this calm, centered presence that I found magnetic. I must have stared a little too long, because she looked up and caught me. Instead of being annoyed, she smiled, put her book down, and asked, "You look a little lost? Need some help?" I told her about my trip, about how I was trying to find a specific campsite nearby, but had somehow ended up hours off track. She didn't laugh, but I could tell she was amused. "You're way off," she said, shaking her head with a smile. "But hey, if you're open to a little adventure, I know a place nearby. Quiet, beautiful, and way better than some overbooked campsite." Her name was Hannah, and she had this easy, grounded way about her that made me feel comfortable. Without really thinking, I took her up on her offer, and we drove our cars to this secluded spot she knew, a patch of field by a river, flanked by thick trees and framed by distant mountains. It was peaceful, in a way I hadn't felt in years. We set up our camps, and as the sun set, we got to talking. She told me she was a park ranger, spending her days keeping the forest safe, guiding hikers, and helping lost travelers like me. She'd grown up in a small town not far from where we were, and the way she spoke about the land and the trees and the rivers made me feel like I was seeing the world through new eyes. We stayed up late, lying under the stars, sharing stories about our lives. It was easy to talk to her. She listened without judgment, with this genuine interest that made me want to tell her everything. I thought it would end there, but the next morning, as I was getting ready to leave, she asked if I wanted to stick around and see some of her favorite hidden trails. It was so far outside my original plan, but something in me didn't want to leave. I ended up staying, and that one day turned into 2, then 3. We spent hours exploring the woods, following her through trails that twisted and turned in ways only she seemed to know. She had a knack for finding little wonders. An old stone bridge covered in moss, a waterfall hidden at the end of a winding path, a field of wildflowers in a clearing I would have missed. By the end of the week, I realized I was falling for her. But I was scared to tell her, afraid that saying something would break the spell we'd been under. As if sensing my thoughts, one night around the campfire, she took my hand. "You don't have to leave tomorrow," she said softly. "But if you do, I want you to know that this week has meant a lot to me." That night, under the stars, I kissed her for the first time. It felt like coming home. For the next few months, I found every excuse I could to come back to that little town. We'd spend weekends together, and slowly, it started to feel like our own little world, a place where we could just be, without any labels or expectations. She showed me the beauty in simplicity, in quiet moments, in taking things slow. We'd wake up with the sunrise, make coffee on a portable stove, and watch the morning light filter through the trees. Eventually, I couldn't bear leaving anymore. I moved to be closer to her, finding a small apartment not too far from where she lived. It wasn't easy. I had to adjust to a completely different lifestyle, leave behind the busyness of city life, and trade in my corporate job for remote work. But being with Hannah made it all worth it. One summer night, we were sitting on the porch of the little cabin she rented on the edge of town, watching fireflies dance across the field. She turned to me, looking serious. "This life we're building, are you happy?" she asked. It was a simple question, but I could see the vulnerability in her eyes. I told her that I'd never been happier, that she was my home. A year later, I proposed to her by the river where we'd first camped together. I told her I didn't need any grand adventure. She was all the adventure I needed. Her answer was a laugh, a tear, and a yes that made my heart feel full. Today, Hannah and I live in a small, cozy cabin we built together on a patch of land near that same river. Our life is quiet and beautiful, filled with all the little moments that first drew me to her. Morning hikes, lazy afternoons, and star-filled nights. Some weekends, she'll still guide hikers or help lost campers, and sometimes, when the stars are just right, she'll pull out that old dog-eared book and read to me as we lie in a hammock under the night sky. Looking back, I can hardly believe how one wrong turn led me to her. I never imagined I'd leave my old life behind, trade city lights for fireflies, skyscrapers for mountains. But that's the thing about love. It finds you when you least expect it, and it takes you places you never thought you'd go. If you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd end up here with her, living this quiet, beautiful life, I wouldn't have believed you. But now, I can't imagine anything else. Hannah taught me that sometimes the most profound journeys are the ones that take you right back to yourself. And every day, I'm grateful for that one small act of kindness that led me to the love of my life. It all began with a book. I know, it sounds like the setup for a rom-com, but stay with me. About 6 years ago, I was going through one of the toughest times of my life. I was 29, recently divorced, feeling directionless, and utterly convinced that I'd missed my chance at happiness. I'd moved back to my hometown to be near family, and I was trying to start fresh, but it all felt heavy, like I was wading through thick fog. One rainy afternoon, I decided to head out to the only indie bookstore in town. I've always loved the smell of old paper and the cozy, hushed vibe of bookstores, so I thought maybe browsing some novels might distract me. Little did I know that this trip would end up being the first chapter in a whole new story. I was in the classics section, flipping through a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, when I heard a voice behind me say, "A favorite?" I turned around to see a tall guy with messy brown hair, round glasses, and this warm, inviting smile. He had a copy of The Catcher in the Rye tucked under his arm. I smiled back, saying something awkward about how I always come back to Austin, and we ended up chatting right there in the aisle. His name was Ben, and he had this mix of intelligence and humor that put me at ease instantly. We kept talking, moving from books to movies to music, laughing like we were old friends. He recommended a novel I'd never heard of, and I grabbed a copy, not really planning to read it, but just enjoying the moment. Finally, after what must have been an hour, he asked if I'd like to join him for coffee. I surprised myself by saying yes. The bookstore had a little cafe attached, and as we sat there with our coffee, the conversation just flowed. He told me he was a high school English teacher, which made sense. He spoke with this calm and thoughtful way that reminded me of someone who'd spent years guiding teenagers through complex ideas. He had a passion for literature and a way of talking about it that made me see old stories in new light. Hours went by, and eventually I realized it was dark outside. I'd come to the bookstore just to escape my thoughts for a while, and instead I'd found myself completely drawn in by this stranger. Before we parted ways, he asked for my number, and I gave it to him, my heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. A few days later, he texted me, and soon enough, we were spending every weekend together. Our dates were unconventional. We'd meet at little bookstores, exploring shelves, swapping recommendations, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence reading side by side. One evening, we went to his favorite spot, a little secondhand bookstore with a hidden upstairs loft, and sat on the floor for hours, lost in conversation about philosophy, love, and all the things that make life messy and wonderful. Ben had a way of listening that made me feel truly seen. He'd remember the smallest things I said, surprising me with little notes tucked inside my books, or sending me quotes he thought I'd like. We were both careful, both a little guarded. I think both of us were afraid of getting hurt again. But over time, we opened up about our pasts, about the heartbreaks and mistakes that had shaped us. I told him about my divorce, my struggles with feeling not enough, and he shared stories of his own, about how he'd moved back to town to be closer to his aging mother, about his fears of letting her down. A few months in, he invited me to meet his mother. She was a gentle, soft-spoken woman who welcomed me with open arms and told me stories about Ben as a kid. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, and it made me fall for him even harder. Ben and I started to build this quiet, steady life together. We'd spend weekends going on road trips to small towns with charming bookstores, cooking meals from old recipes, and hosting little movie nights with our friends. It was simple, but it was also the happiest I'd ever been. A year later, he surprised me with a trip to a cabin in the mountains. It was beautiful, nestled in the woods, with a small lake nearby. On our first morning, we took a walk by the lake, just as the sun was coming up. As we stood there, surrounded by nothing but the sound of water and birds, he pulled out a small, worn notebook from his jacket. It was filled with notes, small memories, funny things I'd said, places we'd visited, all written down in his careful handwriting. On the last page he'd written, "Will you marry me?" I couldn't believe it. Tears filled my eyes, and I said yes before he even had a chance to pull out the ring. Our wedding was small, just close friends and family, held in that very same cabin by the lake. We didn't need anything fancy. The day was perfect as it was. And as we stood there, surrounded by our loved ones, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. All the heartache, the uncertainty, the years of feeling lost, it had all led me here to him. We've been married now for almost 5 years. Life has had its ups and downs, of course. We've had job changes, family struggles, and health scares. But through it all, we've leaned on each other. Every anniversary, we go back to that little bookstore where we first met, and he buys me a book with a note hidden inside. It's a tradition, a small reminder of that first day, of how one unexpected moment can change everything. Sometimes I think back to that rainy afternoon and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the bookstore that day. If I'd never met Ben, I don't know where I'd be, but I know it wouldn't be here, in this life we've built together. He taught me that love doesn't have to be complicated, that sometimes the best things in life come quietly, slipping into your world like a book you didn't know you needed. In our living room, there's a wall lined with all the books we've collected together over the years. Each one has a memory, a story, a piece of us. And every time I look at that shelf, I'm reminded of how lucky I am, how one small chance encounter in a bookstore gave me the love I thought I'd never find. I wasn't looking for love. In fact, love was the last thing on my mind. At 32, I was in the middle of a career transition, moving from New York to San Francisco. I'd spent years in the city, working my way up in a fast-paced PR firm, but the constant stress finally caught up to me, and I realized I needed a change. Rather than flying across the country to start my new life, I decided to do something completely out of character. Take a cross-country train. It would give me time to unwind, reflect, and maybe even rediscover myself. I boarded the train early in the morning. As I found my seat, I noticed someone sitting across from me, already engrossed in a book, his face partially hidden by a worn baseball cap. There was something serene about him, his focus, the way he leaned slightly forward with a gentle smile playing on his lips as he read. I tried to get comfortable, hoping we'd both stay in our own worlds for the journey, but fate had other plans. About an hour into the trip, the train made a sudden jolt, and my coffee spilled, splashing across my bag. I cursed under my breath, frantically trying to clean it up with tissues. The man looked up from his book, noticed my predicament, and immediately reached into his bag, pulling out a small towel and offering it to me. "Here, this might help," he said, with a slight smile that held both kindness and amusement. I thanked him, grateful but also slightly embarrassed. We exchanged a few polite words, and I learned his name was Tom. He was traveling back home to San Francisco after spending a month helping his sister with her newborn. As the train rolled on, our small talk turned into a deeper conversation, and by the time we reached the dining car for lunch, we were chatting like old friends. Tom had a calmness about him that instantly put me at ease. He was thoughtful and insightful, asking questions that made me reflect on my life in ways I hadn't before. He shared stories from his childhood, his dreams of becoming a chef, and the little quirks of his family that made him laugh. Every story he shared had this warmth to it, and I found myself hanging on to every word. We spent the rest of the day talking, losing track of time as the landscapes changed outside the window. By evening, we were sharing our favorite songs through shared headphones, our heads leaning close together as the train rumbled on. I was drawn to him, not just in the way he looked, though his soft eyes and warm smile certainly didn't hurt, but in the way he made me feel. Being around him was like being wrapped in a cozy blanket, safe and warm. As night fell, I felt a pang of sadness. In just a few days, we'd be in San Francisco, and this magical bubble would burst. I didn't want to think about it, so I pushed the thought away, focusing on each moment with him. That night, neither of us could sleep, so we found ourselves in the observation car, watching the stars glinting through the windows. There was an undeniable pull between us, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. As the lights flickered dimly, he reached over, taking my hand in his. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. We didn't say anything. We just sat there holding hands in silence, letting the moment speak for itself. The next morning, we woke up to find ourselves in a small town somewhere in the Midwest. We decided to step off the train during a longer stop, wandering around a bit, exploring the quiet streets, and grabbing coffee from a local shop. It felt like a little adventure, like we were the only two people in the world. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. By the time we boarded the train again, I knew that I didn't want this to end. I didn't want to go back to a life where Tom wasn't there to make me laugh or share his ridiculous obsession with obscure jazz records. But I didn't know if he felt the same way. As we neared San Francisco, I grew quiet, bracing myself for the inevitable goodbye. But when the train finally pulled into the station, he surprised me. "Would you like to grab dinner with me tomorrow?" he asked, almost shyly, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart soared. I managed a quiet, "Yes," and we exchanged numbers, promising to meet the next evening. That dinner led to countless more. Our relationship unfolded like a beautiful story, each chapter revealing new depths of love and understanding. Tom became my best friend, my confidant, my home. He encouraged me to pursue my dreams, to take risks, and to trust myself. He challenged me in all the right ways, but he also knew when to just hold me close and let me be. 3 years later, on a cool autumn night, we took a trip to the same train station where we'd met. As we stood on the platform, he pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package, a vintage watch, engraved with the coordinates of the exact spot where we first met on the train. He took my hands, looked into my eyes, and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. I said yes, tears streaming down my face, unable to believe that the love I'd once thought was impossible had found its way into my life in the most unexpected way. Today, Tom and I are married, and every time we hear the sound of a train, we smile, knowing that our story began with a simple act of kindness and a shared love of adventure. Sometimes, when we're on a road trip or just sitting together in silence, I look over at him, and my heart still races. I never imagined that a spontaneous train ride would lead me to the love of my life. But that's the beauty of life. You never know what's waiting for you around the corner, or, in our case, across the aisle.